Correct too. In the Chinese tradition, once you have the opponent on the ground, traditionally there are no the wrestling. Okay, now this is interesting because in the Mongolian tradition, you assume you get trampled. In the Chinese tradition, once the opponent's on the ground, the fight is over. I'm not exactly sure what the antecedent to that is, but culturally, to me at least, it's interesting. Okay, let's shift our focus now to Judo. Judo has many similar techniques, of course, but Judo, as you'll see, is much different in part because the stance work is different. Notice first of all, after they bow in, notice the position they start from. They grab the lapels, and notice that they're much closer together, so their center of gravity is much higher. I should say that the uniforms they're wearing, in Korean we call it a dobok, in Judo we call it a gi, represents clothing. But we have no pockets, we have no zippers, we have no buttons. It's basically to represent any type of clothing, and the top is reinforced to resist tearing when it's grabbed. Now, one of the main principles in Judo is something called kazushi. The idea behind kazushi is off-balancing, so that when your opponent overcommits their weight or their force, you exploit it. One of the principles in Judo is to use minimal force and get maximum result. Notice that in that move, Steve actually shifted his weight and took what's called a sacrifice throw, sacrificing his stand to throw his opponent. Let me point out something. This is kind of important too, because if we go force against force in a Western style, in the West we say the best defense is what? A good fight fire with. Right. So if we were going head to head, and let's say he weighed 250 pounds and I only weighed 150, and we're in this sort of situation, who's going to win? He's going to win, right? But let's say that I use Judo. Ju means the way of softness, the way of giving. He pushes me, and instead of pushing him back, I yield and use his force against him. Or if he punches, instead of meeting force with force, I meet force with void. So the idea in Judo is to win by yielding. Judo is the way of softness, the way of gentleness. Again, by punching, he overcommits. He gives too much energy. He gives too much force. And he actually contributes to his own detriment. So that's one of the principles. Okay. In Judo, you get points for taking your opponent to the mat, and you also get points for holding his shoulders down. Chris and Steve are going to now demonstrate what's known as newaza, ground technique. In the Japanese and the Judo tradition, the fight is not over once your opponent's on the ground. I'll hold it right there. Does this look familiar? Okay, let me paint the picture. Let's say their pants were very colorful, they had no tunics, and they had lots of hair. Does that look familiar? Well, I'm here at the back. Does that look familiar? So, Japan and Iran, two different parts of the Silk Road, similar tradition. Okay? Sorry, gents, go for there. Now you notice that in addition to pinning his shoulders to the ground, also Chris uses pressure on the joints. The predecessor of Judo was something called Jiu-Jitsu, which developed on the battlefields of Japan, where an opponent might have armor on. So striking an armored opponent would not be terribly productive, but using his weight and momentum against him could be productive, and once you had him to the ground, attacking the movable joints, the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, would be an effective way of fighting. Dr. Jigoro Kano took the battlefield principles of Judo, of Jiu-Jitsu, made them safer, and created Judo, the way of gentleness. Also, it's important to note that in the throws and even in the mat work, oftentimes the objective is to put the opponent on the back. This is a much safer position. Let me emphasize that point. In more battlefield combat orientations, instead of dropping the opponent on his back where he can see me and he has his hands to defend himself, there are traditions where you would drop him on his face. Here, it's harder for him to see, it's more difficult for him to protect against attacks, and his vital spine, floating ribs and so forth are more exposed. So the fact that Judo concentrates on throwing the opponent on the back as opposed to dropping him on his front, and also instead of dropping him on his head, drop him on his back instead of driving his head into the ground. Judo lets him go on the back, means it's more of a sport application than a battlefield application. If I drop him on his face, he has much less of a chance of defending himself. Okay.